For hundreds of generations, the Jedi Knights were the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic. They were a beacon of hope, a symbol of serenity. From their noble beginnings on Tython to their systematic destruction, tonight we are exploring their entire history. A complete timeline of how to do everything right and still get it all wrong. But to understand the Jedi, their triumphs, and their catastrophic failures, we have to go back. Our story begins not with an order, but with a gathering, tens of thousands of years before the Skywalker saga. In mysterious pyramid ships, the great Thoyor traversed the galaxy. They did not conquer. They did not announce themselves with blaring horns or demands. They simply appeared, hovering silently over worlds, calling to those who were different, those who could feel the strange energy that binds all living things. They gathered these Force sensitives from dozens of species and transported them to a single, extraordinary world, Tython. Imagine a planet that is not merely alive, but is an active participant in your very existence. Tython was the source, a fountainhead of the Force so pure and potent that it was physically dangerous. It wasn't a tranquil paradise. It was a world of violent Force storms, of continents that buckled and reformed, of creatures born from raw cosmic energy. To live on Tython was to be in a constant state of negotiation with the universe itself. And here, the gathered travelers founded not the Jedi, but the Jedi Order. Now, here is the core premise. What if these first philosophers had it right? The Jedi did not believe in the light side. They also did not believe in the dark side. They believed in balance. To them, the Force had two primary aspects: Ashla, the light, representing creation, peace and order, and Bogan, the dark, representing destruction, passion and chaos. They saw these not as good and evil, but as necessary halves of a whole, like the two moons that orbited their world. To be a master of the Force was not to choose one and forsake the other, but to walk the razor's edge between them. To have passion, but not be consumed by it. To seek peace, but not become stagnant. This philosophy permeated their entire culture. Their weapons were connected by a cable to an external power pack. This wasn't just a technological limitation. It was a metaphor. The wielder was tethered, reminded that their power came from an external source, that they were a channel for the Force, not its master. So, what happened? If this philosophy of balance was so central, so seemingly wise, where did the dogmatic, light side only Jedi Order come from? The answer, as it so often is war. But the first great war wasn't against some external foe. It was a civil war. The Force Wars of Tython. A faction of Jedi arose who believed that the dark side, Bogan, was too dangerous, too seductive to be merely balanced. They argued it must be conquered, rejected, and vanquished entirely. They were the adherents of the light. They saw their balanced brethren as naive, playing with a fire that would inevitably burn down the entire house. The conflict that followed was catastrophic, scarring Tython itself. In the end, the light siders won. They declared the dark side anathema. They declared the pursuit of balance a fool's errand. They vanquished or exiled all who held to the old ways, and from the ashes of this philosophical schism, they rebranded themselves. They were no longer the Jedi, the mediators of the whole. They were the Jedi, the champions of the light. And here lies the quiet tragedy that would haunt them for the next 25,000 years. The Jedi Order was founded not on a pure revelation of truth, but on the victory of one ideology in a civil war. They began their existence by fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of the very energy they swore to serve. They chose a side, believing it was the only way to be safe. They mistook half of the universe for the whole thing, and in doing so, they created their own shadow. By defining themselves in opposition to the dark, they gave it a power and a mystique it never had before. They created the very enemy they would spend millennia fighting, both in the galaxy and within their own hearts. It was a decision born from fear, and it would echo for millennia. Having established their new ideology, they set out from their scarred homeworld of Tython to establish a new center of power, a place to house their sacred texts and anchor their philosophy in the galaxy. They found it in the furthest reaches of the uncharted regions, on a planet of dramatic stone islands, endless ocean, and a deep, raw connection to the living force. They found Arch too. When we see this world through Luke Skywalker's lonely exile, it doesn't immediately strike you as a cradle of enlightenment. It's breathtaking, yes, but it's also deeply melancholic. The wind howls a mournful tune across the cliffs, and the waves crash with a relentless, percussive rhythm, as if trying to wear the island down to nothing. It feels less like a monastery and more like a magnificent tomb. And here, on the highest peak of the main island, the first Jedi built their temple. We see the stone huts, the ancient library nestled within a living Uneti tree, and at the very heart of it all, a mosaic set into the floor. It depicts the Prime Jedi, the symbolic founder of the Order, sitting in meditation. But the image is jarring, a direct contradiction to 25,000 years of Jedi dogma. The figure is perfectly split down the middle one half obsidian black, the other pearlescent white. This mosaic is our first clue that something is amiss. The Jedi, in their later histories, would surely interpret this as a symbol of the light side conquering and containing the dark. But what if that's just revisionist history? What if this mosaic is a holdover from a time before the schism? A relic of the Jedi, depicting their core belief in balance. If that's true, it means the Jedi built their most sacred sanctuary on a foundation of a philosophy they had actively rejected. They enshrined a symbol whose true meaning they chose to forget. This raises a crucial question. Why here? Why build your first and most holy site on a waterlogged rock at the furthest edge of known space? Was it simply for peace and quiet, to get away from the galactic hustle and bustle? Or was the isolation the entire point? Were they trying to keep the galaxy out, or were they trying to keep something in? Let's gently entertain a different possibility. What if Arch 2 is not primarily a library, but a prison? Imagine that during the devastating Force Wars on Tython, one of the leaders of the dark side faction, a being of immense power, was not killed but contained. Unable to destroy them, the victorious Lightsiders exiled them to this remote world, building the temple not as a monument, but as a lock. A sophisticated, force-powered cage. Under this theory, the generations of Jedi who lived on Arch 2 were not just scholars studying ancient texts. They were wardens. Their daily meditations, their rituals, their very presence were all part of a great work, constantly pouring light side energy into the planet's core to reinforce the prison and keep the ancient darkness from seeping out. This reframes the Jedi librarians as less scholars and more supernatural security guards on the night shift, making sure the ancient space monster in the basement doesn't get any funny ideas. Suddenly, other details about Arch to click into place. Think of the mirror cave that Rey is so powerfully drawn to. Luke describes it as a place strong with the dark side, a place that offers temptation without reward. Why would such a potent dark side nexus exist at the very heart of the Jedi's origin point? The convenient answer is that the dark side is a natural part of life and can be found anywhere. But the more speculative, and perhaps more interesting, answer is that the cave isn't an anomaly. It's a leak, a crack in the prison wall where the influence of the entity sealed below can be felt most acutely. And what about the island's strange, amphibious caretakers, the Lanai? We see them as simple, diligent custodians mending the Jedi huts and tolerating Luke's grumpy presence. But perhaps their role is far more significant. What if they are the descendants of a race who made an ancient pact with the first Jedi? They are not mere housekeepers, they are the hereditary guardians of the site. Their lives dedicated to the physical and spiritual maintenance of the prison. Their endless, quiet work is its own form of ritual, their presence on the island a vital component in an ancient cosmic equation. There's another complementary theory. Perhaps the temple's function wasn't just containment, but amplification. The planet is so saturated with the Force, its location so unique, that the temple could act as a focusing lens, a cosmic antenna. A Jedi master meditating there could potentially project their thoughts, their vision, their very will across the galaxy. This could be why Luke's brief reconnection to the Force was immediately felt by both Leia and Snoke. He wasn't just reaching out, he was broadcasting from the galaxy's most powerful force, Wi-Fi hotspot. The signal is just so strong that sometimes you get some spooky dark side pop-up ads like that mirror cave. So Arch could be all of these things at once, a library of a forgotten truth, a prison for an ancient evil, and an amplifier of immense power. It's a place of terrifying importance and precarious balance. This would explain the deep-seated sorrow that clings to the stones and the sea spray. It also gives new weight to Luke's self-imposed exile. He didn't just go there to hide and die. He went to the source, the central server room of the Jedi Order, to unplug it from the Force entirely. He believed the Jedi's legacy was failure, and he sought to end it at the beginning. It was a desperate attempt to fix a 25,000-year-old bug in the system. The Jedi's decision to build their order on such a volatile foundation while simultaneously preaching a doctrine of absolute light was a profound contradiction. By exiling the dark-siders and suppressing the philosophy of balance, they didn't eliminate the darkness. They gave it a cause. The vanquished followers of Bogan, now scattered and defeated, would not simply fade away. They would regroup in the shadows, their defeat hardening into resentment, their philosophy of passion twisting into a lust for power and revenge. They would forge a new identity in direct opposition to the Jedi. The Great Schism was not an end, but the beginning of a far longer, darker war. Thousands of years pass. The Republic rises, expands, and the Jedi Order settles into its role as the established, official Force tradition of the known galaxy. Their doctrine of light side purity, forged in the Force wars of Tython, is now absolute, unquestioned dogma. Their temples are centers of learning and peace. From the outside, it is a golden age. But inside the Order, the same questions that caused the first schism were beginning to be asked again. A new generation of dissenters arises. These are not malicious, power-hungry monsters, at least not at first. They are brilliant, curious Jedi Knights, scholars and warriors who, in their deep study of the Force, come to a dangerous conclusion: the Order is wrong. They look at the Jedi Code's insistence on serenity and the rejection of emotion, and they see not strength, but a crippling limitation. They argue that to truly understand the Force, one must embrace all of it. Passion, anger, love, fear, these are not flaws to be suppressed, but powerful tools to be understood and mastered. To deny them is to deny half of life itself. In a way, without even knowing it, they were rediscovering the lost, ancient wisdom of the Jedi. They saw their Jedi brethren as stagnant, complacent, and blinded by their own self-imposed rules. Their initial goal, we can speculate, was not to destroy the Jedi, but to reform it, to save it from its own dogmatic slumber. The ensuing debate became the single most significant internal conflict in the Order's history since its founding. It was an argument that raged for a century, a period that would later be known as the 100-Year Darkness. It was the ultimate academic dispute that got way out of hand. It began with quiet arguments in dusty archives and ended in open warfare, proving you should never disagree with a librarian, especially one with a laser sword. To the Jedi Council, this was not a philosophical debate, it was a plague. They saw the dissenters' ideas as a direct path to the dark side, a seductive heresy that threatened to undo millennia of stability. They could not, or would not, see the nuance. There was only the light, and this was its opposite. The conflict was brutal, a civil war that pitted Jedi against Jedi. In the end, the sheer numbers of the loyalist Jedi, backed by the might of the old Republic, won the day. The victorious Jedi rounded up their defeated, fallen brethren, but they chose what they saw as a merciful path. Instead of execution, they stripped the survivors of their weapons and their titles and loaded them onto unarmed transport ships. They were exiled, cast out from known space to wander the uncharted void, a final, definitive statement that their ideas had no place in the Republic. It was an act of supreme arrogance, a belief that they could simply throw their problems into the darkness and forget about them. An act of mercy that would curdle into the galaxy's greatest threat. Now, let's follow those exiles. Imagine the state of their souls as their ships plunged into the black. They were defeated, humiliated, and betrayed by the very people they once called brother and sister. Every argument they had made about the Jedi's fear and intolerance had just been proven right in the most violent way possible. The Jedi's philosophy of peace was a lie, enforced by the sword. Their rejection of passion was a lie, born of fear. Any lingering hope the exiles had for balance was likely scoured away by a white-hot, singular desire for revenge. Their journey ended on a forgotten world, a planet that was, for them, a paradise. It was a searing, red-dusted planet named Korriban, a world already steeped in the dark side, littered with the monumental tombs of ancient and powerful dark side kings. For the Jedi, Korriban was a place of evil. For these exiles, it was a sanctuary, a place where the Force felt whole again, and they were not alone. Here they discovered a native species, the pure-blood Sith, a race of red-skinned humanoids with a rigid caste system and a primitive, but potent, command of dark side sorcery. To these isolated people, the exiled Jedi, with their mastery of the Force and their advanced knowledge, were like gods descending from the heavens. Through a combination of manipulation, force, and interbreeding, the exiles subjugated the Sith species and elevated themselves to the status of rulers, the Dark Lords of the Sith. They took the name of the planet and its people for their new order. Here, in the furnace of Korriban, their philosophy was forged into its final, terrible shape. The Jedi ideal of balance was now a distant memory, utterly incinerated by their hatred. They would define themselves in perfect opposition to their betrayers. If the Jedi claimed the light, the Sith would master the dark. If the Jedi preached serenity, the Sith would harness the explosive power of passion. The Sith Code, as it would be written, is a direct, snarling rebuttal to the Jedi mantra. Peace is a lie. There is only passion. Through passion, I gain strength. Through strength, I gain power. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken. It's the ultimate teenage rebellion anthem written against the Jedi's galactic-sized parental authority. So, were they rebels with a valid cause? We have to imagine that, at the beginning, they were. Their critique of the Jedi Order's emotional suppression was not only valid but deeply necessary. Yet, their defeat and exile poisoned that cause. Their search for a more holistic understanding of the Force became a simple, brutal quest for power. Their desire for reform curdled into a lust for revenge. In a stroke of cosmic irony, the Jedi, by casting them out, had ensured they would become the exact monster they had always feared. It's a classic case of the Streisand effect. By trying so hard to hide and exile the dark side, the Jedi made it infinitely cooler and more alluring to anyone with a rebellious spark. The Jedi, believing the crisis was averted and their rebellious brethren exiled forever, turned their focus back toward the galactic core. Their greatest failure was now hidden from sight, a festering wound in the dark, so they did what any large, victorious institution does. They consolidated their power and defined their public role. For thousands of years, the Jedi Order became synonymous with the Republic itself. They were not just monks or philosophers, they were the guardians of peace and justice, a formal, sanctioned arm of the galactic government. This was their golden age, or so the story goes. We see the idealized images from the High Republic, noble Jedi in brilliant white and gold, venturing into the unknown, symbols of hope and compassion. For over 1,000 generations, Obi-Wan Kenobi would later recall, the Jedi Knights were the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic. He spoke the line with a deep, wary nostalgia. But here we must pause and ask a critical question. What if this role, this deep integration with a political state, was not the Jedi's greatest triumph, but their most subtle and profound corruption? What if, in their eagerness to serve the Republic, they slowly, almost imperceptibly, stopped serving the will of the Force? The will of the Force is a cosmic, transcendent thing. It is balance, life, and connection on a scale we can barely comprehend. A government, even one as vast and well-intentioned as the Old Republic, is an entirely different animal. It is a creature of laws, of borders, of economic interests and political compromise. For a time, the goals of the two might align, but they are not and can never be the same. By swearing their allegiance to the Republic, the Jedi tethered their spiritual destiny to the messy, complicated, and often morally grey world of politics. They became agents of the state. Imagine a serene order of mountain monks who also agree to be the county sheriff's department. At first, it seems harmonious. Their wisdom guides their enforcement of the law, but soon, they're not just meditating on the nature of existence. They're investigating noise complaints, enforcing zoning regulations, and getting tangled in local political disputes. Their higher purpose is inevitably diluted, eroded by 1,000 daily, mundane compromises. The Jedi faced this exact dilemma, but on a galactic scale. You can just imagine a revered Jedi Master, fresh from a deep communion with the cosmic force, getting a priority summons from the Chancellor's office. Master T, we need you on Cato Nemoidia immediately. A trade federation is disputing a new tariff, and negotiations have become tense. It's difficult to listen to the will of the universe when you're being dispatched to function as galactic-level human resources. This entanglement had a corrosive effect on the Jedi soul. It bred arrogance. They built their greatest temple on Coruscant, the political heart of the galaxy, in a colossal tower that looked down upon the endless city. It was a perfect metaphor for their new position. They were no longer walking among the people, they were observing them from on high. Their wisdom became institutionalized. They began to confuse the Republic's laws with cosmic law, and their role as peacekeepers with being the sole arbiters of morality. Their connection to the living force, the energy that flows through the messy, vibrant, and chaotic lives of ordinary people, began to fray. They could feel the great tides of the cosmic force, but they were growing deaf to its whispers. This institutional blindness is precisely what the resurgent Sith were counting on. While the Sith were playing a long, patient game of galactic revolution, guided by a singular dark vision, the Jedi were bogged down in the day-to-day business of the Republic. They were putting out political fires, mediating disputes, and chasing pirates. They were so busy being good policemen that they failed to notice the master criminals buying the police station. We can see evidence of this institutional mindset in concepts like the Jedi Service Corps. In the latter days of the Order, Jedi initiates who failed to pass the trials to become a knight were not simply allowed to find their own path. They were reassigned, shuffled off to the agricultural corps to help grow food, or the educational corps to become teachers. On the surface, it's a noble idea everyone can serve, but it reveals a deeper, more bureaucratic truth. The Order had begun to view force sensitivity as a resource to be graded and allocated based on its utility to the Republic. Your personal journey with the Force was secondary to your function within the system. This is why a figure like Qui-Gon Jinn was so disruptive to them. He consistently chose to follow the immediate, intuitive will of the living Force over the dictates of the Council. He would ignore a direct order to focus on what he felt was truly important, like the fate of a single slave boy on a forgotten desert world. The Council saw him as a reckless maverick, dangerously disobedient. But looking back, we can see that Qui-Gon wasn't a bad Jedi. He may have been one of the last true Jedi, one who remembered that their allegiance was to the Force, not to a committee. He was that one employee who consistently ignores the corporate mission statement because he's too busy actually doing the job everyone is supposed to be doing. Naturally, the management found him deeply annoying. The ultimate price for this political marriage was paid when Sheev Palpatine, Darth Sidious, was elected Supreme Chancellor. The Sith Lord became the head of the very state the Jedi had sworn to protect. They were caught in a perfect trap of their own making. If they moved against him, it was an act of treason against the Republic. If they followed his orders, they were serving the Sith. Their own laws, their own political alliances, their own sense of duty, all became the bars of their cage. It's the ultimate cosmic prank. The Sith didn't need a Death Star to destroy the Jedi Order. They just needed to understand bureaucracy. The Jedi fell not because they were weak or evil, but because they had allowed their purpose to be subtly redefined. They traded their spiritual authority for political power, and in doing so, bound themselves to a republic that was already rotting from the inside out. This slow decay, this spiritual malaise, created the perfect environment for a new kind of crisis to emerge, embodied by a figure who would walk the line between the light and the dark, and in doing so, challenge the foundations of everything the Jedi and the Republic believed themselves to be. And into this brittle, golden age walked a man who would challenge all of it, a Jedi Knight whose name would become a legend, a warning, and a mystery all at once. Revan. His story is perhaps the ultimate parable of the old Republic, a tale of a hero who walked a path between light and dark and, in doing so, exposed the fatal flaws in the Jedi's philosophy. Our story finds Revan as a charismatic and prodigiously powerful Jedi Knight during the Mandalorian Wars. A brutal warrior culture from the Outer Rim, the Mandalorians were carving a bloody path through Republic space, committing genocide and burning worlds, and the Republic was losing badly. Before the might of their fleets, the Republic military was buckling. Yet, the Jedi Council preached caution. They sat in their high tower on Coruscant, paralyzed by indecision, haunted by the memory of past schisms where Jedi had fallen to the dark side through the passions of war. They feared another Exar Kun, another Ulic Kildroma, and so they forbade any Jedi from joining the fight, choosing meditation and patience while the galaxy burned. Revan disagreed, profoundly. He looked at the suffering, at the inaction of his masters, and saw not wisdom but cowardice. He believed the Jedi had a duty to defend the innocent, a duty that superseded the Council's fearful edicts. In an act of open defiance, he took up the cause of the Republic. He did not go alone. A significant faction of the Order, mostly younger knights and Padawans who shared his fire and idealism, flocked to his banner. They called themselves the Revanchists, and they went to war. Revan proved to be more than a Jedi. He was a military savant, a strategic genius. He adopted the Mandalorians' own tactics, learned their culture, and showed a pragmatic ruthlessness that horrified his old masters, but won battle after battle. He became the great hero of the Republic. After finally shattering the Mandalorian forces, Revan and his fleet, along with his closest friend Alec, pursued the last remnants into the unknown regions, determined to ensure the threat was gone for good. They were gone for years. When their fleet returned to Republic space, it was not with a hero's welcome. Revan was no longer Revan. He was Darth Revan, Dark Lord of the Sith, with Alec by his side as his apprentice, Darth Malak. They declared war on the very Republic they had just saved, sparking the devastating Jedi Civil War. This is the official story. A classic, tragic tale of a hero corrupted by the violence of war, falling to the allure of the dark side. But what if it's not that simple? What if the official story is just a cover for a truth far more terrifying and complex? Let's speculate. Let's imagine what Revan and Malak truly found out there, in the star-dusted darkness beyond the galaxy's edge. What if they didn't just find desolate ruins of the old Sith? What if they found the real Sith Empire, the one founded by the Jedi exiles thousands of years before, which had been growing, festering, and building its strength in secret all this time? Imagine Revan, fresh from his victory, coming face to face with the true Sith Emperor and Ancient, immortal being of unimaginable power, and realizing the pathetic Mandalorians were just a minor probe, a test of the Republic's defenses. In that moment, Revan is faced with a terrible, impossible choice. He knows the Republic, with its corrupt Senate and its passive, dogmatic Jedi Order, stands absolutely no chance against this hidden empire. He knows if he returns with a warning, the Council will dismiss him. They would see his story as a delusion, the ravings of a mind scarred by war and touching the dark side. So, he makes a desperate, galaxy-altering gambit. He decides the only way to save the Republic is to conquer it. He embraces the dark side, not out of temptation, but as a tool. He will become the enemy the Republic needs, to forge it into a weapon sharp enough to face the true threat. His fall to the dark side wasn't a fall at all. It was a sacrifice. It's the ultimate ends justify the means argument, played out on a galactic stage. Revan decided to burn down the village himself in order to save it from the much larger fire he saw gathering on the horizon. Look at his actions as Darth Revan through this lens. His war was brutally efficient, but strangely targeted. He focused on military and industrial centers, building a consolidated war machine. He even commissioned a terrifying superweapon, the Starforge, an ancient Rakatan factory that could produce an endless fleet. The goal wasn't just chaotic evil, it was rapid militarization. He had to prepare the galaxy for a war he knew was coming, a war no one else could see. His famous mask, taken from a Mandalorian who died questioning the war, became a symbol of his new persona, the necessary monster he had to become, hiding his true, desperate purpose from everyone, even his own apprentice. The supreme irony, then, is that the Jedi Council's plan to stop him is what ultimately doomed the galaxy. They captured Revan, wiped his memory, and retrained him as a loyal Jedi, using him as a weapon to dismantle his own empire. The Jedi Council's plan was the strategic equivalent of discovering your head of cybersecurity has gone rogue, giving him amnesia, and then asking him to help you reset the company's master password. It's a bold move. By saving the Republic from Darth Revan, they undid all his secret preparations, leaving the galaxy fat, happy, and utterly defenseless for the true Sith invasion that would arrive generations later. Revan's life is a tangled knot. A Jedi who becomes a Sith to secretly save the Republic, who then becomes a Jedi again to destroy the Sith Empire he built, which was secretly meant to save the Republic from another, bigger Sith Empire. Revan's story is a direct challenge to the Jedi's binary worldview. The Council saw him as a tragic failure, but perhaps he was a pragmatist, a visionary who saw a terrible truth and was willing to sacrifice his honor, his soul, and his place in history to confront it. His journey suggests that the most rigid codes are the ones most easily shattered by reality, and no code was more rigid than the Jedi's own famous mantra. It's a creed that, on the surface, sounds like the pinnacle of wisdom, but when we look closer, it reveals itself to be a blueprint for failure. No code was more rigid and ultimately more self-defeating than the Jedi Code itself. It reads, "There is no emotion, there is peace. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. There is no passion, there is serenity. There is no chaos, there is harmony. There is no death, there is the Force. Let's gently pull this apart, line by line. Let's treat it not as holy scripture, but as a psychological instruction manual, and see what kind of person it's designed to create." It begins with the most audacious and impossible claims. There is no emotion, there is peace. The intended meaning is clear. A Jedi must rise above their feelings to achieve the clarity necessary for wise action. But this is not how minds work, human or otherwise. You cannot simply decree that an emotion does not exist. Telling a frightened child there is no fear does not make them brave. It only makes them ashamed of being afraid. This line doesn't teach a Jedi to process emotion, to understand it, or to channel it. It teaches them to suppress it, to deny its very existence. It creates a state of perpetual denial. And suppressed emotion doesn't vanish. It festers. It becomes a poison. This single line is the key to understanding the downfall of Anakin Skywalker. He was a being of immense feeling love for his mother, fear for his wife, anger at his powerlessness. The code offered him no tools, only denial. That buried pressure is what Palpatine found and so expertly exploited. Next, there is no ignorance, there is knowledge. Again, this sounds noble. A Jedi should be learned wise and trust in what they know. The danger, however, is when an institution believes it has already acquired all the necessary knowledge. This line can foster a profound intellectual arrogance. By the time of the Republic's twilight, the Jedi had become complacent in their knowledge. They operated from their vast archives, believing their understanding of the galaxy was complete. So when Qui-Gon Jinn, their most attuned to the living Force maverick, brought them undeniable proof of the Sith's return, they rejected it. The Sith have been extinct for a millennium, they said, hiding behind the certainty of their library. It's the ultimate actually, philosophy. Their knowledge had become a blindfold, preventing them from seeing a truth that didn't fit their established narrative. Then we have the infamous line, "There is no passion, there is serenity." This is the heart of the Jedi's emotional suppression doctrine. Passion is the engine of life. It is the fire that drives creativity, the fierce loyalty that builds families, the righteous fury that fuels rebellion against injustice. To forbid it is to demand that a living being act as if they are not truly alive. The Jedi's strict rules against attachment, most extreme in the prequel era, are a direct result of this line. Interestingly, this wasn't always the case. In the deep history of the Old Republic, it was understood that Jedi could and did form bonds, even marry and have families, like Revan himself with Bastila Shan. The later Jedi Order's fanatical stance against it was a symptom of their decay, a doubling down on dogma as they felt their influence slipping. By forbidding love, they forced it into the shadows, where it became a point of shame and vulnerability. Anakin's secret marriage was not the problem. The rule that forced it to be a secret was. Some versions of the code include the line, "There is no chaos, there is harmony." This encourages a kind of dangerous passivity. It's an assertion that the universe has an underlying, benevolent order. While a comforting thought, it can blind one to the reality that sometimes things are just chaotic. Sometimes there is no grand plan. Believing in an imaginary harmony makes you vulnerable when real-world chaos erupts. The Council's hesitation during the Mandalorian invasion was a symptom of this thinking, a belief that if they just waited, the Force's harmony would reassert itself. Telling someone caught in the middle of a firefight that there is no chaos, there is harmony, is the philosophical equivalent of hanging a "keep calm and carry on" poster in a building that is actively on fire. Finally, the code concludes with its most poetic and perhaps most deceptive line, "There is no death, there is the Force." Of all the tenets, this one feels the most like a genuine comfort. It speaks to a beautiful, transcendent truth about the continuity of life energy. However, when used as a tool of dogma, it can be profoundly unhelpful, even cruel. It can lead to a cavalier disregard for the tragedy of loss. When a terrified Anakin Skywalker comes to Yoda, plagued by premonitions of Padme's death, what is the Council's wisdom? Mourn them, do not. Miss them, do not. Attachment leads to jealousy, the shadow of greed. That is, he is essentially told to be happy for her future transformation into the Force. This is useless advice for a young man grappling with love and fear. Yoda's counsel here is like a doctor telling a patient with a shattered limb, "Do not mourn the unbroken state of your leg, for it has now transformed into its new, broken state." It is technically true, but emotionally and spiritually vacant. That rigid philosophy of denial, the Jedi Code's insistence on suppressing the very core of a person's nature, didn't just create emotionally brittle monks. It had a direct, physical manifestation. It bled into the way they moved, the way they fought, the way they practiced their most iconic and sublime art-form lightsaber combat. To the casual observer, a duel is just a dazzling dance of light and sound. But to a student of the lore, it is far more. The 7 classical forms of lightsaber combat are not just sets of techniques, they are philosophies in motion. A Jedi's chosen form is a window into their soul, a physical language that often speaks a truer story than their words. Let's begin with Form I, Shi-Cho. This is the foundation, the first style taught to every youngling. It consists of simple, sweeping attacks and broad defensive blocks. It's not elegant, but it's reliable. In its simplicity, Shi-Cho reflects the ancient, foundational nature of the Jedi Order itself. It is the starting point, essential but ultimately lacking the sophistication needed to deal with the galaxy's more complex threats. From this foundation, a desire for elegance and mastery led to Form 2, Makashi. This is the duelist's form, all precision, economy of motion, and intricate blade work. Wielded one-handed for maximum flexibility, Makashi is designed for one purpose: defeating another swordsman. It is the form of the aristocrat, the fencer, and it speaks of supreme confidence, control, and perhaps a touch of hauteur. It is no coincidence that its most famous modern practitioner was Count Dooku. His choice of Makashi perfectly mirrors his personality, a political idealist, a man who believed in a more elegant and civilized order, and who held a deep belief in his own superiority. It's a beautiful form, but it fell out of favor for a reason. It was designed for a civilized age that was rapidly vanishing. As the galaxy grew more chaotic, filled with blaster-wielding thugs and mindless droids, the Jedi needed a new answer. They found it in Form Thu, Sorisu. This is the ultimate expression of the Jedi's guardian philosophy. Sorisu is pure defense. Its movements are tight, efficient, and designed to expose as little of the body as possible, creating a nearly impenetrable shield of light. A master of Sorisu doesn't win by overwhelming their opponent, but by outlasting them, letting them exhaust themselves against an immovable wall. Its greatest master was, of course, Obi-Wan Kenobi. His devotion to Sorisu is a perfect mirror of his soul. He is the protector, the patient watcher, the man who would rather defend than attack. His fighting style is the Jedi equivalent of a turtle. He will simply sit inside his shell of light, patiently waiting for you to make a single, fatal mistake. It is infuriatingly effective. In stark contrast is Form IV, Ataru, the acrobat's form. Ataru relies on the Force to push the body to its physical limits, incorporating flips, spins, and impossible leaps into a dizzying, overwhelming assault. This is the form of boundless energy, of joyful exuberance, and maybe a little bit of showmanship, and who better embodies that than Master Yoda? He is not a static defender. He is a spinning, whirling cyclone of green light, his style a perfect expression of his famous lesson. Judge me by my size, do you? Ataru is the physical manifestation of that rebellious, vibrant spark. But as the Jedi were drawn deeper into open warfare, some found Sorsu too passive and Ataru too draining. They needed a middle ground leading to Form V, Djem, so this is the warrior's form. It takes the defensive principles of Soresu and weaponizes them, using an opponent's attack as an opportunity for a powerful counter. It is aggressive, dominant, and relentlessly powerful, and its most devoted practitioner was Anakin Skywalker. His preference for Djem, so is perhaps the biggest tell about his entire character. He is not content merely to protect. He feels compelled to dominate, to overwhelm his enemies, to enforce his will through superior strength. It is the physical expression of his fear of loss and his desperate need for control. After his fall, Darth Vader would continue to use a modified, heavier gem, so his powerful robotic limbs providing the perfect, immovable anchor for its brutal, crushing blows. Then there is Form VI, Niman, the diplomat's form, a hybrid of the first 5 forms. Niman is a jack of all trades, but a master of none. It was favored by Jedi who spent more time in council chambers than on battlefields. Its moderation was its weakness. In the first great battle of the Clone Wars on Geonosis, it was noted by the survivors that the vast majority of the Jedi who fell were practitioners of Niman. Their generalized style simply couldn't stand against specialized killers. Niman is the Jedi equivalent of being pretty good at several sports but never mastering one. It's fine for a casual game, but you wouldn't send that player to the Olympics. Finally, we come to the most controversial and dangerous of all the forms, Form the Juyo, and its specialized variant, Vapad. Juyo is pure, ferocious aggression, so emotionally intense that it skirts the edge of the dark side. For this reason, it was all but forbidden. But one master saw its potential, Mace Windu. He created Vapad, a state of mind more than a set of moves. Vapad does not suppress the wielder's inner darkness or passion. It accepts it, channels it, and uses it as a conduit. A Vapad master takes their opponent's fury, their dark side energy, and reflects it back at them, creating a superconducting loop of power. Mace Windu's mastery of Vapad is the ultimate clue to his character. He was a man who walked the razor's edge, using his own shadow to serve the light. It's why he, and perhaps only he, could stand blade to blade with Darth Sidious. He was fighting a mirror that hits back harder. The very evolution of these forms tells the story of the Jedi Order's struggle. The slow drift from elegant dueling to pragmatic defense and finally to aggressive warfare shows how the galaxy forced them to change. The mere existence of the Vapad proves that at least one Jedi Master understood the fundamental flaw in the code, that denying your inner darkness makes you weak, but truly mastering it could make you invincible. This kind of insight was tragically rare. Most Jedi preferred to place their trust not in such dangerous self-exploration, but in the comforting certainty of prophecy. Yet even there, their vision was fatally clouded. The prophecy of the Chosen One. It was an old legend, a promise whispered down through generations of Jedi. It foretold the coming of a messianic figure, an individual who would be conceived by the midi-chlorians themselves, born of no father. This individual, the prophecy stated, would be the one to ultimately destroy the Sith and bring balance to the Force. For the prequel-era Jedi, this wasn't just a quaint myth, it was an active variable in their galactic calculations. And when Qui-Gon Jinn arrived from a dusty Outer Rim world, with a small boy in tow, a boy with no father, and a Force potential that was literally off the charts, they were forced to confront the possibility that the prophecy was walking and talking in their temple. Their decision to train Anakin Skywalker. Despite their deep reservations about his age and his emotional attachments, was a hinge upon which all of galactic history would turn. They believed they were nurturing their prophesied savior. But prophecies are slippery, dangerous things, and the Jedi, in their institutional arrogance, believed they understood its terms perfectly. Let's look at those terms again. First, the simple part, destroy the Sith. The Jedi took this in the most literal, military sense. The Chosen One would defeat the Sith Lords in combat and end their threat. And, from a certain point of view, Anakin did exactly that. At the end of his life, as Darth Vader, he lifted his master, Darth Sidious, and threw him into the heart of the Death Star, destroying him. the two Sith Lords were gone. Prophecy fulfilled, right? But what if destroy the Sith meant to eradicate their ideology, their influence, their very legacy? In that, Anakin was a spectacular failure, becoming the most powerful and enduring symbol of the Sith philosophy for an entire generation. This brings us to the more complex and misunderstood phrase, bring balance to the Force. For millennia, the Jedi had operated under a critical assumption. They believed that balance meant the absolute victory of the light side and the complete eradication of the dark. But what if the Force itself has a different definition of balance? Let's return to the ancient wisdom of the Jedi on Tython. They believed balance was not the victory of one side, but a state of equilibrium between the two. Now, consider the state of the galaxy at the start of the Clone Wars. There were 10,000 Jedi Knights, beacons of the light side, serving the Republic. And how many Sith were there, operating in the shadows? A master and an apprentice. 10,000 to 2. From a cosmic perspective, that is a state of profound, dangerous imbalance. The board is tilted entirely to one side. If the Force is a self-regulating system, what would it do to correct this? The answer is terrifyingly logical. Anakin Skywalker did bring balance to the Force. He did it by slaughtering the Jedi. At the end of Revenge of the Sith, as Order 66 rings out across the stars, the scales are reset. How many are left? Two powerful Jedi Masters in hiding Yoda and Obi-Wan, and two powerful Sith Lords in power Vader and Sidious. The numbers are almost perfectly even. The Chosen One did his job. The Force, through its living agent, performed a radical, catastrophic market correction to rebalance its own portfolio. But let's take this speculation one step further. What if the prophecy was never about a single person? What if the Chosen One isn't a unique, one-time messiah, but a recurring cosmic pattern, a natural law? Let's propose that whenever the Force tilts too far out of balance for too long, either to the light or to the dark, it spontaneously generates a Nexus being, an individual of immense power, to violently reset the board. Anakin wasn't the Chosen One. He was simply the latest, most dramatic iteration of the Chosen One phenomenon. Look back through history. Could Revan have been a Chosen One for his era? He was a being of immense power who walked both paths and whose actions shattered the status quo, forcing a total reset of both the Jedi and the Republic. Look forward. Luke Skywalker's journey fits the pattern. He rises to challenge an ascendant dark side, is tempted by both, and his ultimate act of balance isn't killing the Sith, but redeeming his father, healing the wound within the Force's most powerful family. Rey, too, is a perfect candidate born of a dark lineage but drawn to the light, a dyad in the Force, a living embodiment of the struggle for balance. The Chosen One prophecy, then, isn't a promise of a savior. It's more like a cosmic weather forecast, predicting that a long period of extreme pressure will inevitably result in a hurricane. The Jedi Order's fatal misreading of the Chosen One prophecy was a symptom of a much deeper illness, an institutional arrogance that made them blind to any truth that didn't conform to their traditions. They put their faith in a prophecy, but lacked the wisdom to interpret it, because they had stopped listening to the very source of that wisdom, the Force itself, in its living, breathing, immediate form. And the one Jedi Master who might have guided them back to that path, the man who listened to the whispers of the living Force over the shouts of dogma, the one who found Anakin Skywalker in the first place, was the very heretic they consistently and fatally ignored, Qui-Gon Jinn. To understand the tragedy of the Jedi, you have to understand Qui-Gon. He was not a rebel for the sake of rebellion. He was a man of deep and abiding faith. But his faith was placed in the Force, not in the institution that claimed to represent it. He was calm, centered, and patient, yet there was always a rebellious twinkle in his eye, a quiet confidence that came from trusting his own instincts above all else. Where the Jedi Council was focused on the grand, distant movements of the cosmic force, the prophecies, the political tides, the slow march of destiny, Qui-Gon was a disciple of the living force. He believed the will of the Force was not found in dusty scrolls, but in the here and now, in chance encounters, in moments of empathy, in the chaotic, unpredictable currents of life itself. His actions on Tatooine are the perfect illustration of his philosophy. The Council would have seen his focus on a local slave boy as an unacceptable distraction from the primary mission, protecting Queen Amidala. But Qui-Gon felt the Force swirling around Anakin Skywalker like a vortex. He followed that intuition, gambling the entire mission on a feeling. He wasn't just trying to find a new hyperdrive, he was participating in the unfolding will of the universe, right there on the ground level. This brings us to the great, sorrowful what if of the entire saga. What if Qui-Gon Jinn had survived his duel with Darth Maul? What if he had been the one to train Anakin? The galaxy would have been a different place. Obi-Wan Kenobi trained Anakin out of a sense of solemn duty, a promise made to his dying master. He loved Anakin as a brother, but he was not the father figure the boy so desperately needed. Qui-Gon was older, wiser, and possessing a maverick spirit that mirrored Anakin's own. He would have understood the boy's tempestuous emotions not as flaws to be stamped out, but as powerful energies to be understood and guided. Imagine Anakin as a teenager waking from a nightmare about his mother suffering in the desert. The Jedi Code and a teacher like Obi-Wan would instruct him to meditate on his fear, to let go of his attachment. It is the proper, dogmatic response. What would Qui-Gon have done? We can almost hear him saying, with that calm certainty, "Then we should go to her." He would have taught Anakin to confront his attachments with courage and compassion, not to let them fester in the darkness of shame and secrecy. Qui-Gon's approach to Jedi psychology was essentially, let's talk about our feelings, and if that doesn't work, let's go solve the problem with a lightsaber. It might be unconventional, but it's a universe away from simply telling a terrified boy to meditate harder. A living Qui-Gon, with the Chosen One as his Padawan, would have been a constant, disruptive force for good within the temple. He would have challenged the Council's slide into political servitude, questioned their passive strategies, and perhaps, just perhaps, he would have been the one to sense the true nature of the Chancellor who took such a keen interest in his apprentice. The ultimate proof of his philosophy, his final and greatest act of heresy, came after his death. It is Qui-Gon who, from beyond the grave, rediscovers the ancient path to retaining one's consciousness after death, becoming one with the Force. He learns this from the mysterious shaman of the Wills, a source of knowledge completely outside the Jedi archives. In their millennia of accumulated knowledge, the Jedi had forgotten how to achieve true immortality. They, who spoke so cavalierly of becoming one with the Force, had no idea what it truly meant. The maverick, the heretic they marginalized, was the only one connected enough to the deep magic of the universe to relearn the secret. That he was then able to teach this skill to Yoda and Obi-Wan is the final, beautiful irony. The entire spiritual survival of the Jedi Order rested on the wisdom of the man they refused to listen to. You have to imagine the awkwardness of that first Force Skype call for Yoda. The death of Qui-Gon Jinn was the snapping of the Jedi Order's last moral compass. Without his dissenting voice, without his grounding in the living Force, the Council was left to navigate the coming storm with only their brittle dogma and clouded prophecies as a guide. They were adrift, and Palpatine knew it. He had spent decades carefully engineering a trap, and with Qui-Gon gone, the Jedi were about to walk right into it. The trap was a war, a conflict so vast and all-consuming it would not only threaten the Republic, but would fundamentally corrupt the soul of the Jedi Order itself. It was called the Clone Wars. It begins, as all great tragedies do, with a moment of perceived heroism. 200 Jedi stand in the center of a Geonosian arena, lightsabers ignited against 1,000 battle droids. It is a noble, desperate stand, and it is a slaughter. They are only saved by the sudden, impossibly convenient arrival of Yoda with a brand new, ready-made army. An army of clones commissioned in secret a decade prior by Jedi Master Sifo Dyas, a man known for his troubling premonitions and funded under the oversight of a mysterious benefactor named Tyrannus, who was, of course, the new Sith apprentice, Count Dooku. The entire affair was a Sith fabrication from start to finish. In the chaos, the Republic Senate, gripped by fear, grants emergency powers to Chancellor Palpatine. His first act is to formally accept this clone army, creating the Grand Army of the Republic. Then he turns to the Jedi, the traditional guardians of peace, and offers them a choice. They can stand aside and watch the Republic crumble under the separatist onslaught, or they can accept command of this army and lead the war effort. It is a perfect dilemma. From a political and military standpoint, there seems to be only one answer, and so they accept. In that moment, the Jedi Order, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. They were no longer peacekeepers. They were generals. Let's consider the profound moral compromise at the heart of this decision. The Jedi, champions of freedom and individual will, were now the commanders of a slave army. The clones were not volunteers. They were living weapons, bred in labs for the sole purpose of fighting and dying on command. They had no choice in their fate. The same Jedi Order that saw the injustice in one small boy's servitude on Tatooine now oversaw the servitude of millions, and the irony seems to have been almost entirely lost on them. The war effort turned the Jedi Council into the galaxy's most spiritually enlightened, yet morally bankrupt, middle management team. This, we must understand, was the entire point. The war was never truly about the Republic versus the Separatists. That was merely the stage dressing. The war was the weapon. Palpatine, controlling both sides, wasn't trying to conquer the Jedi in battle. He was trying to erode them from within, to make them destroy themselves. And it worked perfectly. First, the war severed their connection to the Force. A battlefield is a storm of fear, anger, pain, and death. It is the antithesis of the serenity and peace required for clear Force perception. By immersing themselves in this environment day in and day out, the Jedi became spiritually deafened. The fog of war was literal for them. As Yoda himself lamented, the dark side clouds everything. Impossible to see. The future is. They were too busy commanding troops and planning strategies to feel the subtle deceptions swirling around them. Second, it shattered their public image and, by extension, their own self-image. The Jedi were no longer seen as mystical monks, but as the leaders of the Republic war machine. They adopted military ranks: General Kenobi, Commander Tano, Master Windu. This wasn't just a change in title, it was a profound psychological shift. They began to identify more as soldiers than as members of a spiritual order. This new role was the perfect incubator for Anakin Skywalker. All the traits the Council found so troubling: his impatience, his aggression, his desire for decisive action, were assets in a general. He thrived in the chaos of war, becoming the hero with no fear, the poster child for this new, corrupted version of the Jedi. The war validated his worst impulses, making him a hero for the very things that were leading him toward the dark side. It was the ultimate grooming process, with Palpatine as the encouraging mentor and the Jedi Council as the out-of-touch superiors, forced to applaud the results even as they feared the methods. For Anakin, the Clone Wars was the galaxy's deadliest internship. Finally, the war served as the perfect delivery system for the final blow. Palpatine's strategy was diabolically brilliant. The war scattered the Jedi's strength across the galaxy, placing 1 or 2 Jedi in command of every clone battalion. It isolated them from the temple and from each other, and it surrounded them day and night with men who loved and respected them, men who would follow them into any battle, and who were also secretly, biologically programmed with a single, dormant command. The whole conflict was just Palpatine's elaborate, 3-year-long surprise party for the Jedi. And the surprise was treason. The Jedi Order, compromised and exhausted by 3 years of brutal warfare, was a hollowed-out version of its former self. They had become generals, their connection to the Force frayed by the constant noise of battle. This spiritual blindness, this fog of war, was now so thick that they failed to sense the most intimate and terrible betrayal of all. A command hidden not just in the minds of their soldiers, but woven as a virus into the very fabric of the Force itself. The time had come. From his chambers on Coruscant, the newly crowned Emperor Palpatine spoke 4 simple words into his communicator: "Execute Order 66. What follows is one of the most heartbreaking sequences in the entire saga. Across the galaxy, on a dozen different worlds, we see it unfold with sickening precision. On Mygeeto, Master Key Adi Mundi leads a charge alongside his clone Marines, who abruptly stop, turn, and gun him down. On Felucia, the warrior Ayla Secura is admiring a native bird one moment, and the next, she is riddled with blaster fire from the men she was laughing with. In the skies above Cato near Moedia, Plo Koon's starfighter is flanked by his trusted wingmen, who suddenly, calmly, blast him out of the sky. The betrayal is absolute, instantaneous, and catastrophic. The official explanation, which we learn later through the heroic efforts of the clone Trooper 5s, is technological. Every clone was grown with a biological inhibitor chip implanted in their brain. Order 66 was one of 150 contingency orders, and this one identified the Jedi as traitors to the Republic, compelling the clones to execute them without question. A switch is flipped, free will is overridden, and the puppets obey their master. It's a clean, tidy, technological solution. But it leaves one massive, nagging question. How could they not have sensed it? We are talking about thousands of Jedi, from powerful High Council masters to seasoned knights, all of whom possess a preternatural ability to sense thoughts, emotions, and intent. A Jedi can feel the fear of a single being across a crowded room. How could they fail to sense the imminent, murderous intent of an entire platoon of soldiers standing 5 feet away? Even with the fog of war, a betrayal on this scale should have been a screaming, deafening alarm bell in the Force. The shock on their faces isn't just surprise, it's a deep, profound confusion. The attack came from nowhere. Here we must speculate that the inhibitor chip was only half of the equation. What if Palpatine, a Sith Lord who had delved into the darkest and most forbidden arts, enacted Order 66 not just as a spoken command, but as a galaxy-wide Sith incantation? What if the chip wasn't the weapon itself, but merely the receiver, an antenna that made every clone vulnerable to a psychic virus broadcast through the Force? Imagine it this way: the Order was a dark side spell, a Sith sorcery that did two insidious things. First, it actively cloaked the clone's murderous intent, wrapping it in a shroud of impenetrable darkness that Jedi perception simply couldn't pierce until the first shots were fired. Second, and far more terrifyingly, the spell may have worked by hijacking and inverting the clone's own positive emotions. The camaraderie, the loyalty, the genuine affection the clones felt for their Jedi generals, these were powerful bonds in the light side of the Force. The Sith virus would have latched onto this emotional energy and twisted it into its perfect, cold opposite. Love became hate, loyalty became betrayal. The very light that connected them was used as the delivery system for the darkness. This would explain the chilling speed and efficiency of the betrayal. Commander Cody goes from respectfully handing Obi-Wan his lightsaber one moment to ordering his cannons to fire on him the next, with no hesitation. It's too clean, too absolute to be just a chip overriding his motor functions. It's an emotional and spiritual override. Order 66 wasn't just programming, it was a possession. Palpatine cast a galaxy-wide curse of extreme betrayal, with a dramatic initial effect and the long-term side effect of guilt and trauma for any clone who eventually broke free of its influence. This theory elevates Palpatine from a mere political schemer to a dark sorcerer of almost unimaginable power. He didn't just give an order, he performed a ritual that affected millions of sentient minds across thousands of light years simultaneously, and did so in a way that was completely invisible to the most powerful mystics in the galaxy. The Jedi were not just outmaneuvered politically, they were defeated on a deep, metaphysical level of the Force that they, in their arrogance, no longer even understood. They were playing checkers, believing themselves to be grandmasters. Palpatine was playing five-dimensional chess on a spiritual plane, using souls as his pawns. It was never a fair fight. Order 66 was a clean sweep, a devastatingly effective purge that reduced a galaxy-spanning spiritual order to a handful of terrified fugitives in a matter of hours. The Jedi were now public enemy number one, hunted by their former soldiers and led by the ghost of their greatest hero, the newly christened Darth Vader. The initial shockwave of the betrayal was followed by the crushing realization of their new reality. They were alone. They were hated. They were the last embers of a fire that had been violently extinguished. This is where a question naturally arises, a question that seems, on the surface, to be a damning critique of the survivors. With dozens, perhaps even 100 or more powerful knights and masters still alive, scattered among the stars, why did they not regroup? Why was there no organized Jedi resistance? Why did so many powerful beings, people who could move objects with their minds and wield swords of pure energy, choose to simply hide? It can look like an act of profound cowardice, a dereliction of the very duty they swore to uphold. But the truth, as always, is far more complex, a tapestry woven from trauma, strategy, and a devastating spiritual crisis. First, we must acknowledge the sheer, paralyzing weight of the psychological trauma. This was not a simple military defeat. This was an intimate betrayal on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine fighting for years alongside men you trust with your life, men you consider brothers, only to have them turn on you in an instant. their faces cold and unrecognizable. Imagine discovering that your entire religion, your government, and the prophecy you placed your faith in were all parts of an elaborate trap laid by an evil you didn't even know existed. This is enough to shatter not just a person, but a soul. Expecting the survivors to immediately shake it off and form a coherent rebellion is like asking someone who just survived a plane crash to immediately start training for a marathon. A period of profound shock and grief was not just likely, it was inevitable. Beyond the trauma, there was the cold, hard reality of strategy. The Emperor and Vader did not rely solely on stormtroopers to finish the job. They created a specialized tool for this exact purpose, the Inquisitorius. This was a cadre of fallen Jedi, dark side acolytes who were trained specifically to hunt their former comrades. They were terrifyingly effective for one simple reason: they could sense other Force users. This created a deadly paradox for any potential Jedi resistance. The very act of gathering, of concentrating their power in one place, would be like lighting a massive bonfire in the Force. It would scream their location across the galaxy, drawing every Inquisitor and, eventually, Vader himself. In this new, hostile galaxy, isolation wasn't just a choice, it was the only viable survival tactic. To gather was to invite annihilation. But the deepest reason, the one that truly explains the actions of masters like Yoda and Obi-Wan, goes beyond the practical into the spiritual. What if they chose to hide not out of fear or despair, but out of a terrible, newly acquired wisdom? What if they realized, in the smoldering ruins of their order, the most devastating truth of all, that the Jedi had failed? Their philosophy was flawed. Their dogma was a trap. Their traditions had led them directly to this ruin. Fighting back using the same methods, the same ideology, would just be a repeat of the same mistakes. It would be a pointless, arrogant gesture leading only to their final extinction. Their exile was not just about hiding, it was about penance. It was a retreat, a time to meditate on their colossal failure and to try and understand why it had happened. We have proof of this being the official, albeit secret, policy. One of the first things Obi-Wan Kenobi did after escaping was return to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. He didn't go to retrieve an artifact, he went to change the recall beacon. The signal that would have called all surviving Jedi home was altered, replaced with a new message, a desperate warning to stay away, to trust no one, and to go into hiding. It was a command from the new, de facto High Council of Two, telling the last of the Jedi to scatter and preserve the flame, not to rally and be snuffed out. Obi-Wan's message was the galactic equivalent of a mass text message screaming, "The Partawais KNCLED, a Sith Lord took over the venue, duo Naut Kamari. Under this light, their hiding becomes a different kind of fight. For a Jedi, whose entire being is geared towards connection to the Force, to other living things, the act of severing those connections is a profound struggle. Living a quiet, anonymous life, suppressing their every instinct to reach out and help, was its own form of daily combat. For a man like Obi-Wan, a former General and Council member, pretending to be a simple hermit while haggling over spare parts was likely a more difficult spiritual trial than facing down an army of droids. The choice made by the surviving Jedi to scatter to the galactic winds was not born of cowardice, but of a sudden, terrible wisdom. They understood that the Order itself had to die for the Force to one day be reborn in a purer form. Their war was no longer for the galaxy, but for their own souls, and as the architects of this new strategy of patience and penitence, the two most powerful surviving masters chose exiles that were not just hiding places, but spiritual crucibles. The first of these was Obi-Wan Kenobi. On the surface, his mission seems clear and heroic. He takes the infant Luke Skywalker to his family on the remote desert world of Tatooine and settles nearby to watch over him, a silent guardian protecting the galaxy's new hope. For 19 years, he is the boy's secret protector, the lonely sentinel. This is the simple story, the one we tell ourselves. But it leaves out the most important part of the equation, Obi-Wan's own broken spirit. His exile was not just a protection detail, it was a self-imposed penance. Of all the countless, forgotten worlds in the galaxy, why would he choose Tatooine? This was not a random choice. This was the planet where it all began and where it all went wrong. This was the world where he first met the bright-eyed, hopeful slave boy, Anakin Skywalker. This is the world where Anakin's mother was tortured and died, the event that arguably tipped the first domino toward his fall. For Obi-Wan, a man who famously complains about sand, choosing to live in a desolate hut in the middle of a planet that is nothing but sand is the ultimate act of self-flagellation. Choosing to live under two suns, a constant, searing reminder of the binary choice that defined his life, was no accident. The heat, the grit, the endless desolation, it was a hair shirt. Tatooine was his monastery and his prison cell. Every single day would have been a confrontation with his failure. He was the man who trained the Chosen One. He was the man who loved Anakin like a brother, but who could not save him. He was a master of the Jedi Code, a paragon of its teachings, and he had come to realize that the code itself was insufficient. His last conversation with Anakin wasn't a battle of good versus evil. It was a breakup, a final, agonizing argument with a brother he no longer recognized, culminating in an act of brutal, necessary violence on the shores of Mustafar. "I have failed you, Anakin. I have failed you," he screamed over the roar of the lava. That line was not the end of his pain. It was the thesis statement for the next 2 decades of his life. But his exile was not entirely passive. It was a period of intense and painful re-education. In his solitude, he was finally able to quiet his mind enough to fully commune with the spirit of his own maverick master, Qui-Gon Jinn. The man whose wisdom he had so often questioned in his youth was now his only guide. Through Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan had to unlearn. He had to dismantle the rigid dogma of the Jedi Council, piece by piece. He had to learn the secrets of the living force that Qui-Gon had always championed. He had to learn how one could, in fact, retain their identity after death. His exile was a long, painful deprogramming from the failed religion he had served. This reframes his vigil over Luke. He wasn't just waiting for the boy to come of age so he could hand him a lightsaber and say, "Go kill your dad." He was terrified. Terrified of training another Skywalker. Terrified that the boy held the same darkness as his father and that he, Obi-Wan, would fail to contain it once again. Perhaps his goal was not to train Luke as a Jedi at all. Perhaps his goal was to ensure Luke could live a simple, good life as a farmer, to protect the galaxy from the potential of another Vader by letting that potential lie dormant. For 19 years, his primary job was ensuring Luke Skywalker didn't develop a sudden interest in black robes and dramatic monologuing. The adoption of his new name was a key part of this penance. Obi-Wan Kenobi was a Jedi Master, a general in the Grand Army of the Republic, a member of the High Council, a hero, and that man had failed on every single front. So Obi-Wan had to die, and Ben had to be born. Ben was no one, a strange old hermit who lived out in the Jundland wastes. He shed the identity that was intertwined with his failure, a necessary act of humility. Ben Kenobi is what happens when a Jedi Master has a mid-life crisis so profound he moves to the galactic equivalent of the middle of nowhere, changes his name, and gets really into talking to his spirit guide. Obi-Wan Kenobi's exile was a long, sun-scorched penance on a world that held the ghosts of his personal failure. It was a journey of quiet contemplation. But for the Grand Master of the Fallen Order, a being who carried the weight of not just one student's failure, but the failure of an entire 25,000-year-old tradition, a more profound atonement was required. And so, Master Yoda chose an even deeper, darker, more primal form of exile on a world that was not just a hiding place, but a living embodiment of the Force itself, the swamp planet of Dagobah. At first glance, the strategic reason for his choice is obvious. Dagobah is a world teeming, bursting, overflowing with life. The sheer power of its living force creates a kind of static that would mask his own considerable presence from the Emperor and his hunters. He could disappear into the planet's song, but this is Yoda, the greatest Jedi Master of the age. His choices are never merely practical. We have to assume there was a deeper, spiritual reason for his decision to live out his days in a mud hut, surrounded by gnarled trees and murky water. The real reason he chose Dagobah, we can speculate, was not because of its life, but because of a specific place of death, the Dark Side Cave. When Luke Skywalker arrives centuries later, he feels it immediately. A cold spot in the vibrant warmth of the swamp. That place is strong with the dark side of the Force, Luke says, with a tremor of fear. A domain of evil it is. Yoda confirms and then gives a curious command. Not avoid it, not I will protect you from it, but in you must go. The key to understanding Yoda's exile lies in this moment. He didn't choose Dagobah despite the cave. He chose Dagobah because of it. Obi-Wan's failure was personal. He had lost his brother. Yoda's failure was institutional and absolute. He had presided over the Jedi Order in its most arrogant, dogmatic, and blind phase. He had sat at the head of the Council and personally dismissed the warnings of Qui-Gon Jinn. He had sanctioned the Jedi's role as generals in the Clone Wars. He had been so certain in his wisdom that he stood feet away from the dark Lord of the Sith for years and sensed nothing. His failure was monumental, and so his penance had to be equally vast. For 2 decades, he chose to live next to a pure, concentrated nexus of the dark side. It was not a landmark to be avoided. It was his classroom, his mirror, his confessional. What do you suppose a 900-year-old Jedi Master, burdened with the weight of utter failure, sees when he enters such a place? The cave, as Yoda tells Luke, shows only what you take with you. So Yoda would have seen his own arrogance personified. He would have seen the faces of the thousands of Jedi who died because of his blindness. He would have relived his duel with Sidious, not as a valiant fight, but as the final, humiliating proof of his order's weakness. The cave would have relentlessly shown him his pride, his dogma, and his fear. Yoda's exile was the most extreme form of self-help retreat ever conceived. No calming seas or mindful meditation, just 2 decades in a swamp next to a spooky hole in the ground that exists only to remind you of your greatest mistakes. This ordeal changed him. The Yoda of the prequel trilogy is a stern leader, a powerful warrior, the head of a galactic institution. The Yoda of Dagobah is different. He is humbled. He is a trickster, a whimsical gremlin who finds humor in frustration. The cave seems to have broken down the Grand Master's arrogance and rebuilt him from the ground up as something far wiser. He had to confront, accept, and integrate his own capacity for failure and darkness to finally understand the true nature of balance. In some corners of the lore, it's said the cave itself is the grave of a powerful dark Jedi who was defeated there long ago, his spirit forever tainting the ground. If this is true, it makes Yoda's choice even more poignant. He chose to spend his exile living beside the tomb of a fallen Jedi, a constant, physical reminder of what happens when the Order and its code fail an individual. This reframes his entire approach to training Luke. He isn't just passing on the old lessons. He is teaching Luke the harsh wisdom he learned from his own failure. His cryptic tests and frustrating lessons are designed to break down Luke's arrogance and impatience, the very same traits that led the old Jedi to ruin. When he commands Luke to enter the cave, he is giving him the same test he has been putting himself through for 20 years. You cannot defeat the dark side by ignoring it. You must confront it and the part of it that lives inside yourself. Luke's training was the culmination of Yoda's 20-year-long, extremely muddy therapy session. Yoda's long, quiet exile in the shadow of the dark side cave was his final, painful lesson. He had to unlearn his own certainty, his own pride, to finally understand why his order had fallen. He came to see that the Jedi could not simply be rebuilt as they were. A new path was needed, one forged in humility and a deeper understanding of the Force, and the first steps on that new path would be taken by the boy his old friend Obi-Wan had spent 2 decades watching over from afar. The boy named Luke Skywalker. Luke's journey is the hinge on which the entire saga turns. His defining moment, the one that sets him apart from every Jedi who came before, happens in the Emperor's throne room. He has defeated his father. He stands over a broken Darth Vader, his own black, gloved, mechanical hand holding a lit lightsaber, ready to strike the final blow. The Emperor is cackling, urging him to fulfill his destiny. And in that moment, Luke sees it all. The cycle of anger and violence, the reflection of his father's fall in his own actions. He looks at his own hand, then at Vader's severed arm, and he understands. He turns, deactivates his weapon, and throws it aside. "I am a Jedi," he declares, "like my father before me." This is the most important decision in the entire story. He wins not by killing, but by showing mercy. He wins not with power, but with radical compassion. He rejects both the Sith's lust for dominance and the old Jedi Order's role as a righteous warrior. He demonstrates a third way. This is the birth of the true Luke Skywalker philosophy. So what happens? We know he tries to build a new Jedi Academy. He gathers students, including his own nephew, the powerful Ben Solo. He tries to pass on what he has learned. And it ends in tragedy. The temple is destroyed in fire and blood, his students are slaughtered, and Ben Solo embraces the darkness, becoming Kylo Ren. This catastrophic failure breaks Luke. He exiles himself on Ahch-To, the site of the first Jedi temple, and when a hopeful young woman named Rey arrives seeking his help, he delivers the most controversial line of his life. It's time for the Jedi to end. For many, this felt like a betrayal. The hopeful hero of the rebellion had become a bitter, nihilistic old man. But what if we've been misinterpreting his words and his intent? What if he didn't mean that the philosophy of the Jedi must end, but that the institution must? The Order, the dogma, the sacred texts and the ancient rules. Imagine Luke alone on that island, poring over the very texts that founded the Order. He would see the whole tragic story we have been exploring. He would see the Jedi's balanced philosophy abandoned. He would see how their entanglement with the Republic corrupted them, how their flawed code suppressed them, how their misread prophecies doomed them. He would see that the Jedi Order, as a formal institution, was a failed experiment from the very beginning, destined to repeat its own mistakes. His desire to burn that library tree was not an act of nihilism. It was an attempt to finally break the cycle. His confrontation with Yoda's Force ghost is the key. Luke, full of shame and anger, wants to destroy the symbols of his failure. But it is Yoda, who has had 2 decades to think about this, who calls down the lightning and burns the tree himself. The sacred Jedi texts. Luke cries in horror. "Read them, have you?" Yoda retorts, before delivering the most important lesson of all. We are what they grow beyond. That is the true burden of all masters. In that moment, Yoda validates Luke's entire thesis. The old way, the books, the rules, they are meant to be a foundation, not a cage. Luke wasn't wrong to want to end the Jedi Order. He was simply paralyzed by the guilt of his failure with Ben, unable to see the path forward. His final act, the Force projection on Crate, is the ultimate expression of his perfected philosophy. He confronts evil, saves his friends, and inspires a new spark of hope in the galaxy, all without throwing a single physical punch. He uses the image of a legendary warrior to achieve the aims of a true pacifist. He wins by not really being there. It's a sublime Jedi masterstroke, the perfect evolution of his choice to throw away his lightsaber in the throne room. It was the ultimate galactic mic drop. Luke Skywalker's final, heroic act was the culmination of a lifetime of learning. He had come to understand that the institutional Jedi Order was a failed experiment, and that the path forward required a return to the core principles of the Force. He had, through his own painful journey, rediscovered a fundamental truth that the old masters had forgotten, a lesson his first teacher, Obi-Wan, had to learn in the desert from the ghost of his own master. It was a distinction that Qui-Gon Jinn had championed his entire life, a philosophical schism rooted in the very nature of the Force itself, the difference between the living Force and the cosmic Force. To understand why the Jedi fell, we have to understand this schism. On one side, we have the cosmic Force. This is the Force as most people imagine it. It is the transcendent, binding energy of the galaxy. It is the grand ocean of power that all things flow into and out of. It is concerned with destiny, with the grand tapestry of history, with prophecies, with the impersonal, overarching will of the universe. It is the macro view. The Jedi Council of the late Republic were masters of the cosmic Force. They lived in their ivory tower, meditating on the future, deciphering ancient texts, and placing all their hope in the prophecy of a chosen one. On the other side, we have the living Force. This is the Force in the here and now. It is intimate, immediate, and personal. It is not the great ocean. It is the feeling of the water on your skin. It is the energy of a single blade of grass pushing up through the soil, the frantic heartbeat of a frightened creature, the shared laughter between friends. It speaks not through cryptic prophecies, but through intuition, empathy, and feelings. It is the micro view, and its greatest champion was the Jedi heretic, Qui-Gon Jinn. By the time of the prequel trilogy, the Jedi Order had become dangerously imbalanced. They were almost exclusively focused on the cosmic Force. Their location on Coruscant, a planet-wide city of sterile metal and plastic, is a perfect metaphor. They were physically and spiritually disconnected from the messy, vibrant, living galaxy they were sworn to protect. They became astronomers, so busy gazing at the distant stars of destiny that they forgot they were meant to be gardeners, tending to the life growing at their feet. This philosophical blindness is precisely why they failed to see the rise of the Sith. They were constantly trying to scry the future, to sense the grand movements on the galactic stage, while Palpatine's darkness was a quiet, present tense sickness growing in the room right next to them. They were listening for a cosmic orchestra and completely missed the sound of a single, discordant violin playing a funeral dirge. Most importantly, this imbalance is the reason they failed Anakin Skywalker. Anakin's problems were not cosmic, they were living. He was tormented by immediate, powerful, present tense emotions of fierce, protective love for his mother, a desperate, consuming fear for the life of his wife. When this terrified young man went to his masters for guidance, what did they offer him? Cold, detached wisdom from the cosmic force. Yoda, the ultimate master of the cosmic view, told him to train himself to let go of everything he fears to lose. It is a grand, philosophical statement, the kind of advice you might find in a 1,000-year-old book. For a man drowning in a sea of immediate fear and love, it was profoundly useless. It was like telling a starving man to meditate on the concept of non-attachment to food. Now, imagine how a master of the living force would have responded. Qui-Gon would not have quoted a text. He would have listened to the feeling in the room. He would have felt the boy's pain as a raw, present energy. He would have engaged with Anakin on a personal, empathetic level, understanding that his fear needed to be confronted and soothed, not simply dismissed with a platitude. The living force is about compassion in the moment. The Jedi could only offer Anakin acceptance of a grand, impersonal plan. This is why Qui-Gon was so fascinated by the midi-chlorians. The Council saw them as a simple measure of potential, a biological anomaly. But Qui-Gon, the student of the living force, saw them as the bridge between the physical and the spiritual, the tangible proof that the Force was an intimate, biological reality. The Jedi Council looked at midi-chlorians like they were a strange, slightly embarrassing bodily function. Qui-Gon looked at them and saw the fingerprint of the universe in a single cell. This philosophical divide is also the key to understanding the Jedi's greatest mystery. For millennia, the Order, in its focus on the cosmic force, believed that upon death, a Jedi's consciousness simply dissolved, their energy returning to the great cosmic ocean. It took Qui-Gon Jinn, the heretic who focused on the life that is, to rediscover the secret of preserving the life that was. The Jedi Council's view on death was basically a cosmic delete and merge layers. Qui-Gon was the one who figured out you could save as, and keep your personality as a separate, glowing blue file. Luke Skywalker's journey to perfect the Jedi way led him back to the same fundamental truth his spiritual grandfather, Qui-Gon Jinn, had championed: the importance of the living force. This forgotten philosophy was not only the key to understanding the old Order's failure, but also the key to unlocking their most mysterious, beautiful, and profound achievement, their final victory over the permanence of death itself. This is the mystery of the Force Ghost. We see it as one of the most comforting and iconic images in the saga. A fallen master reappears as a shimmering, blue-tinged apparition, their form intact, their mind and personality preserved, able to offer one last piece of wisdom from beyond the veil. It's a beautiful concept, but it is also deeply strange, and far from the default afterlife we might assume it to be. If all-powerful Jedi achieve this state, where is Mace Windu? Where is Plo Koon, or Kit Fisto, or any of the thousands of masters who fell? The quiet, startling answer is that they are gone, dissolved back into the cosmic force. They could not become Force ghosts because they did not know how. Becoming a Force ghost, it turns out, is not a reward for a life of service. It is an incredibly rare and difficult skill, a technique that was lost to the Jedi Order for millennia and only rediscovered by the heretic who was most in tune with the living Force. The prequel-era Jedi, in their devotion to the cosmic Force, believed that the ultimate goal was to let go of the self and dissolve back into the universal energy. The idea of clinging to one's individual consciousness after death would have been seen as a form of selfish attachment, a violation of the code. It was Qui-Gon Jinn from beyond the grave who became the Pathfinder. As we learn in the deep lore of the Clone Wars, his spirit was guided by the Force priestesses, 5 mysterious beings who are living avatars of the Force. They tested his spirit, and because his life was a testament to the living Force, he passed. But his training was incomplete at the moment of his death on Naboo. This is why, for years, he could only manifest as a disembodied voice. He was the first in 1,000 generations to find the path, and he then had to spend his afterlife teaching the technique to his old master, Yoda, during the long years of the war. Becoming a Force ghost is the Jedi equivalent of a posthumous PhD in cosmic metaphysics, and Qui-Gon started a very exclusive, very spooky online course for his closest friends. So what does this training entail? What is the secret? It is a great cosmic paradox. To retain your individual self, you must first completely let go of it. The key is absolute selflessness. The Force priestess's final test for Yoda was to force him to confront and master his own dark side, his ego, his pride, the part of him that was Darth Yoda. Only by completely surrendering his own will to the will of the Force could he earn the right to keep his identity. This is the very reason the Sith can never, ever achieve this form of true immortality. They crave eternal life more than anything, but their entire philosophy is a barrier to it. Sith ideology is about bending the Force to the individual's will. It is about power, passion, and the supremacy of the self. A Sith Lord is psychologically incapable of the absolute surrender and selflessness required to become one with the living Force. So they are forced to seek pathetic, twisted parodies of immortality, clinging to life through dark science and cloned bodies, like Palpatine, or binding their hateful spirits to physical tombs and artifacts. Becoming little more than angry poltergeists. They can haunt a place, but they cannot join the cosmic flow. This, of course, raises the question of Anakin Skywalker. At the end of his life, he appears as a Force ghost alongside Obi-Wan and Yoda, looking peaceful and whole despite having never received this training. How is this possible? Here we must speculate. Perhaps in the moment of his selfless redemption, giving his own life to save his son, Obi-Wan and Yoda were there in the Force to guide his spirit, to teach him in a single, instantaneous flash of insight what had taken them years to learn. Or perhaps, as the Chosen One, a literal child of the Force, the rules were simply different for him. His final, selfless act may have automatically fulfilled the great paradox, a cosmic pardon granted to him for fulfilling his ultimate destiny. The ability of a Jedi to persist after death as a Force ghost is their most beautiful and enduring legacy. It is the final expression of the living Force, a testament to the idea that true power comes from letting go. It is a gift of guidance, a promise that the wisdom of the past is never truly gone. But what happens when the student who needs that guidance most is a living, breathing echo of the past's most catastrophic failures. What happens when the galaxy's greatest hope is also the galaxy's greatest risk? This is the tragedy of Ben Solo. After his victory at Endor, Luke Skywalker, the new hope for the Jedi, set about doing what was expected of him. He began to build a new Jedi temple, a place to train a new generation, to pass on what he had learned. And at the heart of this hopeful enterprise was his nephew, his sister's son Ben, a boy with a power in the Force that was raw and untamed, a boy who carried the overwhelming legacy of the Skywalker bloodline. Ben Solo's fall to the dark side was not a simple choice, not a single moment of temptation. It was a perfect storm, a tragedy that had been brewing since before he was born. First, there was his lineage. He was the grandson of Darth Vader. In the quiet moments, he could surely feel the same turbulent emotions, the same deep well of power that had defined his grandfather. It was an inheritance of both strength and fear. The galaxy would look at him and see the potential for a hero, but they would also, always, be watching for the shadow of the villain. Second, he was the target of a sophisticated, long-term grooming operation. As we later learn, Supreme Leader Snoke, a puppet of the resurrected Emperor Palpatine, had been whispering in his mind since he was a child. He was actively being poisoned, his insecurities amplified, his fears fed, his anger stoked by a master manipulator. He was a plant growing in poisoned soil from the very beginning. And then there was Luke, who had achieved a purer understanding of the Force than perhaps any Jedi before him. And yet, in his attempt to build a new order, did he inadvertently recreate some of the flaws of the old one? Did he, a man who learned from the ghosts of a failed religion, still preach a version of their flawed code? Did he teach Ben to be wary of his strong emotions, to suppress his passions? If he did, it would have been the worst possible lesson for this particular student. It would have created the same psychological pressure cooker that destroyed Anakin Skywalker, teaching a boy terrified of the darkness inside him that his very nature was wrong. This all comes to a head on one fateful night. The scene is one of the most misunderstood and tragic in the entire saga. Luke, sensing the darkness in his nephew, has reached a tipping point. A point of no return looks into his mind. He is met with a vision of pure destruction. Everything he, his sister, and his friends had fought and bled for turned to ash at Ben's hand. For one single, instinctual moment, the weight of his father's legacy, the fear of raising a new Vader, overwhelms the Jedi Master. He ignites his lightsaber. The thought, he says, was fleeting, and he was instantly filled with shame. But it was too late. Ben Solo wakes to the ultimate nightmare. His master, his uncle, the legendary hero Luke Skywalker, is standing over his bed with a glowing laser sword, seemingly ready to strike him down in his sleep. In that horrifying instant, every poisonous whisper from Snoke is validated. They fear you. They will betray you. You cannot trust them. The person he trusted most in the universe had just confirmed his deepest fears. It was the justification he needed to finally let go, to embrace the anger, and to burn it all down. It was a tragic, galaxy-altering misunderstanding. Ben Solo's fall is a perfect, sorrowful echo of Anakin's. Both were Skywalkers of immense potential. Both were targeted and manipulated by a hidden Sith master. And both were ultimately failed by a Jedi teacher who, despite their best intentions, could not handle the volatile mix of fear and power within them. Anakin was pushed away by the Council's cold, impersonal dogma. Ben was pushed away by Luke's momentary, deeply personal fear. In both cases, the temple burned, and a Skywalker in a black mask rose from the ashes. The failure of Luke Skywalker's temple was a sorrowful, tragic echo of the past. It was the final, definitive proof that the Jedi Order, as a formal institution, was a fundamentally flawed concept, doomed to repeat its own mistakes. Its fear of the dark side, its inability to handle the turbulent passions of its most powerful students, was a cycle of self-destruction. This ultimate failure drove the last Jedi Master into a lonely exile, leaving the galaxy without a guardian, and into this vacuum, this absence of hope, the Force, as it always does, sought balance. It called forth a new champion, not from a noble lineage or a hidden temple, but from a forgotten junk heap on a planet that was nowhere. A young woman named Rey. Rey's origin is the key to her purpose. She is, as she believes herself to be for most of her life, a nobody. An orphan abandoned for drinking money, a scavenger surviving on discarded scraps of the past. Unlike Anakin or Luke, who were discovered and brought into the Jedi tradition, Rey discovers the Force on her own. It awakens in her raw and untamed. Her first uses of its power a mind trick on a stormtrooper. The powerful pull of a lightsaber to her hand are not the results of training. They are pure, desperate instinct. This makes her entirely different. She is a blank slate, unburdened by the dogma, the rules, and the failures of the past. She is a pure, direct conduit for the will of the Force. Of course, the galaxy has one last, cruel test for her: the revelation of her lineage. She is not a nobody after all. She is the granddaughter of Emperor Palpatine, the heir to the darkest legacy imaginable. It is the ultimate challenge to the saga's central question: are we defined by our blood or by our choices? By rejecting the name Palpatine and, in her final moments, adopting the name Skywalker, Rey gives the definitive answer. She chooses her spiritual family, the family of broken heroes and redeemed souls, over the biological family of pure, tyrannical evil. Her journey is also defined by her unique connection to the dark echo of her generation, Ben Solo. The Force links them as a dyad, a bond so powerful it is like one soul in two bodies. This explains their explosive, mirrored power, but it also reinforces the saga's central theme of balance. She is the light that rises to meet his darkness. But their connection is a constant reminder that the two are not as separate as the old Jedi believed. They are intertwined, and neither can be fully understood without the other. This all culminates in one of the most mystical moments in Jedi lore. On the Sith citadel of Exegol, facing her grandfather, the vessel of all the Sith, Rey is on the verge of defeat. She is broken, alone, and all hope seems lost. She reaches out, not with a plan, but with a prayer, and calls out to the Jedi of the past. And they answer. One by one, their voices fill her mind: Obi-Wan, Anakin, Yoda, Qui-Gon, Mace Windu, Ahsoka Tano, Kanan Jarrus. They tell her to rise, that they stand with her. She ignites her saber, and in that moment, she is not just Rey. In me, she says, her all the Jedi. What does this truly mean? On the surface, it's a cosmic power-up, the spirits of the past lending her their strength. But it is something far more profound. Rey, as this pure, untaught vessel, becomes a living conduit for the entire legacy of the Jedi. It is the ultimate manifestation of the living Force. She is not just being helped by the Jedi. For a moment, she is them. Rey's all the Jedi moment was the Force's version of a massive, wireless software update, installing 25,000 years of wisdom and skill directly into her soul without her ever having to crack open a single dusty book. This is a new paradigm for what a Jedi can be. The old order was a top-down institution where knowledge was filtered through masters, apprentices, and rigid codes. Rey represents a direct connection, a living library of Jedi consciousness. This is why she learns so quickly. She is not just figuring things out, she is, on an intuitive level, remembering skills her spiritual ancestors already perfected. It's why she can master healing, an ability of pure compassion that the detached, prequel-era Jedi seem to have forgotten. The re-emergence of this skill of pure, selfless empathy signifies a return to the core of what the Jedi were always meant to be. Her final act against Palpatine is the perfect expression of this new synthesis. She does not overpower him with her own strength or strike him down in anger. She takes up the lightsabers of the Skywalker lineage, the father and the son, and uses them defensively, absorbing his own torrent of dark side hatred and reflecting it back at him. He is consumed by his own evil. It is a victory of perfect, non-aggressive defense. It is the most purely Jedi act imaginable, a victory achieved through a kind of cosmic passive resistance. Rey, a Palpatine by blood, a Skywalker by choice, a conduit for all the Jedi by the will of the Force, stands on the sun-drenched sands of Tatooine. She has closed the book on a long and tragic family saga, and with it, the entire troubled history of the Jedi Order. Her story represents a final synthesis, a new hope born from the ashes of millennia of failure. It leaves us with one last, lingering question as we conclude our long journey through this lore. What will the Jedi, now finally free from the burdens of history, become? To answer that, we must look back at the path we have traveled together. We began with the ancient Jedi on Tython, who understood that the Force demanded balance between light and dark. We saw them fall into civil war and watched as the victorious Lightsiders founded a new, dogmatic Jedi Order, an order born from the rejection of half of its own nature. We watched this order entangle itself with politics, becoming soldiers and police for a republic that was already rotting. We deconstructed their flawed code, a recipe for self-suppression that created brittle, emotionally stunted warriors. We saw how this blindness led them to misread their most sacred prophecy, anointing a chosen one they were utterly unprepared to guide. We saw them fall, betrayed and purged from a galaxy they had tried to protect. We sat with their masters in lonely exile as they slowly, painfully unlearned their own arrogance. We watched a new hope rise in Luke Skywalker, only to see him repeat the mistakes of the past, proving the institution itself was the problem. And now, after 25,000 years, the cycle is broken. The slate is clean. The great, monolithic, and deeply flawed Jedi Order is gone. So, the first and most important step for the future is to ensure it is never rebuilt. The future of the Jedi is not an order, but a way, a decentralized, personal, spiritual path, free from the dogma and hierarchy that caused its downfall. What might this new Jedi way look like? It would have to be grounded in a return to the oldest wisdom, the balance of the Jedi. The goal would no longer be the impossible purity of the light, the denial of emotion. The goal would be wholeness. A new generation of Jedi would be taught to acknowledge their fear, their passion, and their anger, not as enemies to be vanquished, but as parts of themselves to be understood, integrated, and balanced. The new Jedi mantra might be less, "There is no emotion, and more emotions are complicated. Let's have some tea and talk about it." This new way would be centered on the living force. It would abandon the old order's obsession with cosmic destiny and grand strategy, and instead focus on compassion in the here and now. The new Jedi would not be generals or political agents. They would be healers, guides, and mediators, serving the will of the Force by serving the needs of individual living beings. Rey is the perfect founder for this new path. As a Palpatine who chose the light, she embodies the idea that we are defined by our choices, not our nature. As one half of a dyad, she has an innate understanding of the connection between darkness and light. As a student who learned from instinct and from the spirits of the past, she is free from the indoctrination of the old ways. Her lightsaber, with its blade of brilliant, sun-like yellow, is the perfect symbol for this new beginning. It is the color of a new dawn, a sentinel's cautious optimism for the future. This new Jedi way would be built upon the lessons paid for in blood and sorrow. The lesson from Anakin is that love and fear, when denied, curdle into a poison that can burn a galaxy. The lesson from Luke is that compassion is a far greater weapon than a lightsaber, and that failure is the greatest teacher of all. The lesson from Rey is that our legacy is not the blood in our veins, but the choices in our heart. The story of the Jedi, when you strip it all down, is a multi-generational epic about a single, flawed idea. The belief that we can achieve peace by cutting away the parts of ourselves that we fear. It is the story of an institution that became so obsessed with its own purity that it created the very shadows it sought to destroy. After 25,000 years of war, betrayal, and galactic-scale family drama, the ultimate conclusion seems to be that the universe does not reward dogma. It rewards balance, humility, and growth. The wisest advice in the Jedi archives is not some cryptic prophecy, but the simple truth that it has taken them all this time to learn. You must be willing to unlearn everything you think you know. And so, our own long journey through the lore comes to a quiet end. We have traveled from the dawn of the first temple to the twilight of the Skywalkers. We have questioned the official story, listened for the whispers between the lines, and perhaps found a deeper, more resonant truth. The great myths are not just stories of heroes and villains. They are mirrors, reflecting our own struggles with fear, hope, and the search for balance in our own lives. Thank you for spending this time with us, exploring the starlit path of the Jedi. May your own connection to the living world be strong, and may your dreams be peaceful.